sociological advantages and disadvantages. Allergic to conflict. If you are reading this, I would imagine that you are not literally an animal. Therefore, I am not advising anyone to act like an animal in order to seek justice in their life. Unfortunately, I spent the rest of my 40s trying to come up with creative, non-violent solutions to create fairness in my life and failed miserably. Tens of thousands of dollars were spent in my business and my travels in order to compete with the alphas, just to get a chance to be heard, and I failed. However, I do not regret the fact that I never harmed anyone in the process. If so, that would have undermined the very foundation of why I'm doing all this stuff in the first place, to contribute to the world. Some people have had to start wars and revolutions in order to see that their children were fed and cared for. There are times that, in self-defense and with the right support or tools, taking forceful action might be the answer to defend oneself and others from a life-threatening situation, although these situations are rare. Chances are, if people are fighting others and relying on being forceful and intrusive, those are probably the kinds of people who, for whatever reason, simply enjoy violence. Personally, I do not only have an aversion to any form of conflict, but I will also have what many would consider a sort of allergy to any type of fighting. I loathe reality shows. I resist most media that significantly portray any kind of fighting. I have often been viewed as a peacemaker as a child, and although most people might think that this to be an admirable trait, from my perspective, it's not. Leaders are the ones who should be peacemakers. They have the power to fight and win. They should choose to resolve conflicts, not to create fights in order to win. Unfortunately, a lot of peacemakers are simply underdog types who have lost their fangs and decide that for whatever reason, it might be better just to give in. My childhood home was a place where I was mentally and emotionally trapped and could not run away, even if I tried. I also could not fight with any chance of success, so after a while I found ways to cope. I found that most situations in my life and career seemed to resemble my bizarre upbringing, but with a strange exception. If intellect doesn't work, and fighting doesn't work, and there's no other form of support available, that's when this stupid and ugly thing comes into play. Faith. Faith is dangerous. It's mostly toxic. Chances are faith is going to be shackled to its evil twin, religion. In my opinion and my experience, every time I hear the word spirituality, as I look deeper, it looks, sounds, and smells an awful lot like religion. Religion is never void of human tampering with the free will and the minds of well-meaning believers. Ironically, though, it has been the catalyst for some very creative people to get unstuck out of professional obscurity. I recently studied the life of visual artist Margaret Keene, Keene. The surprise ending was that of all the people to help bring justice to her horribly unfair situation was the freaking J-Dubs. The Watchtower Society had an undeniable history of inflicting abuse and trauma on a lot of children and sincere people worldwide for generations. At the same time, ironically though, the Jehovah's Witness cult believes strongly in suing husbands. This was exactly what the artist needed, and the organization was weirdly helpful to hear. Looking back on periods of success and failure, I cannot deny the fact that during my 12 years in cultic forms of Christian fundamentalism, for lack of a better term, I was able to actually make a living in creative careers and as an educator. Some would argue that, well, it was their God that was responsible. It could have been that with all the hype, the experiences and the constant studies that my faith contributing to creating my success. If I were to measure my success based on my faith, I would say that there were other things at work that helped my vocation. The biggest clue is simply this: community. Unfortunately, as most of us know, hype churches and cultic type spiritual communities are not the most sincerely motivated people in the world, although ironically can be hyper supportive, considering the fact that they are hyper motivated. If they don't do everything they can to keep you in their fold, they will probably believe that you are going to be damned for all eternity. This includes influencing people to raise a big family, adopt a sort of healthy lifestyle, in addition that they also want people to be successful for a couple of reasons. Following your dream is a proven way to be happy and satisfied in life, in addition to the fact that it can also be profitable in this funding and drawing attention to their agenda. When a spiritual community supports the dreams and aspirations of its members, it benefits both parties as long as the dreams and aspirations do not contradict its agenda. In addition, the member has to stay loyal in order to maintain their support. I cannot think of a period in my life when enough people were taking a consistent interest in my career besides my successful decade with born-again Christians. If they didn't have a problem with me being gay, I would have probably remained with them. And they were the family I never had, and not an easy community to abandon, especially for those of us who had had a profound conversion experience as an adult. At the same time, their abuse of sexual minorities was the catalyst for me to escape from their toxic and dysfunctional ideologies, politics, mistreatment, and delusional thinking. For me in particular, Christianity was a cruel taskmaster. And at the same time, I had a very warm imaginary friend named Jesus, who I must admit, as a result of believing in that companionship, resulted in me being comforted in times when I have certainly turned to dangerous drugs and risky sexual practices at the height of the AIDS crisis. I am forever grateful for Christian fundamentalists, their churches, their Bibles, and even their mean, loving, judgment, grace, confusing God. Now that I have adopted the scientific method to save my life, I have allowed into my life yet another cruel taskmaster whose cruelty is based on the fact that science is evolving and horribly flawed. In addition, after finding answers, science ends everything with more questions, and with the obvious fact that there's no imaginary friend to comfort me, just cold, hard facts. Therefore, the goal for anyone who is trapped by their society, whether in a literal cage with literal bars and locked doors, is to find a way out that represents who we are as humans. If you are the type of person who steals, and I suppose stealing your way out of something is that you can live with. And unfortunately, there are many hungry children around the world who have to steal food and stuff just to escape starvation and death. For a lot of us, especially if you are treated like you are the runt of the pack, escaping an unfair and unbearable situation needs to represent the kind of life that you are aspiring to. If you are trapped by thieves, you want to escape in order to give. If you are trapped by murderers and you kill them to escape, you are just becoming another murderer like them. Rising above justice can really stink when faced with the nagging dilemma of finding your way out in a manner that your conscience allows, thus resolving injustice with justice and not fighting fire with fire. One of my favorite fictional jailbreak stories is the Shawshank Redemption film, and how the protagonist was treated with injustice, but had to rely on patience and intellect to escape. I have found that creating a healthy combination of faith, logic, and perseverance can be a combination to unlock the most sinister of cages, as long as faith has been, quote, detoxified, end quote. The dilemma of the faith community is not only nearly impossible for anyone to find a group that's void of its conflicts, it's especially dangerous for those who other communities have already branded them as at or toward the bottom of every pecking order. Chances are that community will be another copy of demanding measures to serve the alphas. At the same time, finding a healthy faith without any kind of community can also be prone to a lot of toxic results. For some of us, we might have to create our own sort of custom religion almost entirely from scratch. What if you're essentially wrong about your made-up ideology? What if they're wrong as well? What if you find something that works, whether alone or with others? Sometimes your breakthrough can come without anything related to the subject of faith, with the exception of another piece of irony: your faith in the scientific process. The Bera Effect, Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. As much as I love science, especially theories about parallel universes, I actually am not a big fan of the trendy term Mandela Effect. Although there are better ways to theorize an infinite multiverse, I guess that the Mandela effect should be a phenomenon that enables the social sciences rather than physics. That being said, the idea of false memories points more to human stupidity than it does to help with things like simulation theory, especially when it comes to misquoting various television and movie lines. When it comes to false memories about people, this is where things get deeper into sociological issues. Crowdsourced misunderstandings about Mickey Mouse, C-3PO, the Monopoly guy, the Peanut guy, and other characters are nothing compared to the misunderstandings about actual people, whether living or dead, recognized or unrecognized. There was a vote among baseball fans about who the greatest living baseball players were. and the results were announced in Cincinnati, Ohio in 2015. 4 men paraded through the ball field, while a very angry and confused Yogi Berra, who was watching on television with his granddaughter, who was also quite upset. Lindsay Berra turned to Yogi and asked him if he is dead. "Not yet," Mr. Berra replied. Ironically, his 10 World Series championships, more than anyone in history, were more than those 4 men combined had ever accomplished. The word commonly used in this crowdsourced misunderstanding was that he was overlooked. I know little to nothing about baseball or really anything having to do with sports, so if you asked me, I would have no idea how to vote. I suppose I would just research who had the best scores. However, these were baseball fans who voted, and it is bizarre how they did not do the math when it came to Berra being one of the 4 chosen, if not number 1, which should have been obvious. Although there has been a lot said about this sports travesty, especially since Yogi's granddaughter helped get a documentary made in 2022. I still have not seen anything that really goes deep into why so many valuable people are not fully recognized for their contributions to society in the context of this particular story. One theory that I heard was about branding. After he retired as a professional baseball player, he dabbled in other enterprises, including managing teams, but seemed to be more well-known throughout his years as a spokesman for various products. Although this is a common career change for a lot of retired athletes, for some reason, the public enjoyed Mr. Berra so much as a media personality that they must have forgotten what a valuable player he was. After decades of seeing that smiling little man on the screen, the world seemed to want to quote his many funny and philosophical sayings to the point where they had become household terms. It ain't over till it's over. Was it that he was a short Italian? Perhaps Hanna-Barbera Productions did more damage to his reputation with his image when they created the iconic cartoon troublemaker, Yogi Bear? To add to the irony, he passed away soon after the 4 greatest living baseball players were announced. What a way to go! I must admit that compared to the genius of other public figures like Nikola Tesla, at least Mr. Berra wasn't left in lonesome poverty like Tesla ended up. However, it does cause us to wonder why these things happen. From my perspective, I am always thinking about how many women and men are entirely left out of history who may have had a lot to contribute, but either were never able to produce anything significant or they did not get credit for what they produced. Frank Zappa was one of those people who rarely did anything entirely on his own. In fact, it took a few decades into his music career before he got into recording any albums by himself. Otherwise, he always depended on others. In addition, he admitted that he couldn't even simultaneously sing and play an instrument proficient enough to perform on stage. Therefore, he probably would not have been successful at being a solo artist unaccompanied. In addition to releasing dozens of records, producing music, art, books, movies, symphonies, and more, I grew up not knowing what Mr. Zappa actually did. All I remember as a kid was that big-nosed weirdo on MTV telling viewers to register to vote. I just assumed he was nothing more than some type of political figure or just a television personality. It wasn't until early in high school that I heard a community radio broadcast featuring his music that made me realize more of what he did to contribute to the world. Zappa was not only an example of someone who would have been completely overlooked if it were not for his hiring others to help. Lucky enough to get a record contract, and in addition to a very prolific career, he was mostly misunderstood by the public about what he really did. If there was some kind of popularity contest regarding 20th century composers, especially rare examples of gifted, self-taught symphonic composers, Frank would have been overlooked by the classical community. And from my dealings with these kinds of people, I still believe that to be true, decades after his passing. Another highly renowned public figure that I can mention is Stephen Hawking. I have watched countless episodes of Nova and other science documentaries. PBS, in fact, had a lot of shows specifically based on the work of Mr. Hawking, in addition to programs even hosted by him. When I think of Stephen Hawking, I remember things like whether information gets lost in a black hole, the holographic universe, and phrases like a theory of everything. I have noticed that even with science documentaries produced while he was still alive and at the peak of his career, they completely overlook Mr. Hawking while ironically mentioning key points of his career and discoveries. A lot of these shows were also published by PBS. I decided to ask science fans about this, and they didn't really get much clarity. It could be the rivalry between various science celebrities over the years. It could be that seeing this old loser in a wheelchair that can't even talk was about as boring as watching a short, funny-looking Italians like Frank Zappa and Yogi Berra, no matter how awesome those guys were. Perhaps some people are just too gifted, and as a result, perhaps it's just too much for people. And maybe they feel like they see too much of the same people. In addition to these iconic and overlooked men in history, I think it would be even more difficult to recognize all the gifted women in history. As many men have disappeared from society, we can only imagine how many women have gotten lost in obscurity. And at the same time, there were, on occasion, some very remarkable women who rose above the noise of the con artists and sex symbols. The figure that mostly comes to mind is Karen Carpenter. As a teenager, she could have easily competed equally among young men her age and stood out from among them just with her remarkably skilled drumming. But the public insisted on her focusing on her amazing voice, which I also love to listen to. However, her passion was not only singing, it was just something that she got typecast into. An even more sad story was classically trained pianist Nina Simone. But even though society was progressing quickly enough to allow women of color to be recognized as artists beyond earlier generations, the public still could not accept a black woman creating classical records and concerts, although she tried. Hedy Lamarr was another victim of being typecast, and quite literally, indeed. It took decades before the public would recognize her contributions to science and technology. I just hate to think of all the gifted men and women over the years who had so much to offer that was either stolen or worse, totally ignored. Society could be progressing so much faster if we would listen to those whispers instead of all the shouting of all the power-intoxicated leaders constantly clamoring for our attention. Therefore, one of the reasons why a lot of gifted women and men remain unrecognized is because of this phenomenon and similar crowdsourced pathologies. Social media as something that your loser cousin living in your mother's basement, could be internet famous. Several years later, the term internet famous is rarely used because these days it seems like fame is fame, whether online or on other media platforms. The gatekeepers of mainstream and even alternative media have taken over social media to the point when it is basically no different than other forms of media. A lot of it has to do with the algorithms and the machine learning developments influenced and or controlled by big media, in addition to the sheepish tendencies of the media-consuming public. Most of the time when presented with a picture or a video clip in some sort of feed on various social media platforms, besides trying to cater to what the algorithms think your interests might be, it is just whatever happened to be the most popular at the moment, and thus the snowball effect is at work until that particular meme or whatever has run its course, and we're on to the next one. Unfortunately, as most of us know, popularity doesn't mean quality, relevance, nor does it contribute anything valuable to the world, except for maybe a few cheap laughs. But even though what we are being fed is the result of machine learning, plus the public involuntarily, and for the most part unknowingly, voting on what seems to be the most popular thing at the time, I observe that in recent years, all we see are either alpha types or what alpha types want followers to be exposed to. But in addition to this obvious snowball effect that bombards media outlets, this Bera effect that I am referring to is also a strange social phenomenon. Sometimes something or someone is just too obvious that they get overlooked, like an elephant in the room. I would imagine that just about everyone on Earth, especially as a child, wondered what life was really all about. Is reality really real? Why is there suffering? What is the meaning of all of this? And then they get bombarded with a lifetime of Mickey Mouse, Coca-Cola, and for those of you poor unfortunate kids who grew up during the plague, Baby Shark. I have noticed that when several significant classic rock artists are mentioned, the Grateful Dead are often overlooked. In addition, multi-talented singer, songwriter, multi-instrumentalist, poet, and painter Joni Mitchell can often be someone who gets overlooked. In recent years, she appeared on mainstream primetime television, and one of her songs went viral next year. And it was interesting to get the overall reaction of older generations hearing so many young people who had never heard of her. As much as I enjoy watching science documentaries, the ones that portray things like deep time history, like to show dinosaurs eating each other, followed by them all dying. Before that, they talk about how life started with this goo in puddles. Based on so many of these stupid shows, I have noticed that they like to skip the part of life itself developing, and that this obvious issue demands a lot more details. In addition, can life be created in a laboratory? Yes, sort of. They did it in the mid-20th century, or at least they created the building blocks of life, which I still find admirable. Are these producers really that clumsy to overlook that very obvious thing that makes, as far as we know, Earth the most unique place in our solar system? If they were afraid of church people, they probably would have slanted their views in matters of faith rather than science. Could this Bera effect have to do with overlooking the obvious to where it is affecting everything from the workplace to our schools? For instance, let's say there's one black kid in a particular school. Everyone knows that he's better at sports, music, theater, and dance than other students. But in the interest of fairness, or perhaps other reasons, let's say that he rarely gets to be in the spotlight, is often left out of things that he could do better than other kids. It is too easy for the public to overlook those who are hiding in plain sight. Some significantly recognized people are just too familiar and perhaps a bit of a cliche that media consumers might overlook them. This is what I would consider the Vera effect. A kid at the top of the class might be overlooked for various reasons as well. I have dealt with that personally. But with that being said, overall, in my opinion, when there is someone or something that is being overlooked, it's typically not because it's too big. Chances are that if nobody's talking about someone or something in particular, it's an issue of smallness instead of bigness. The science of stupidity. Too big or too small? A century ago, a scientist proposed something in a short paper presented to the scientific community on the subject of particle physics. It had to do with the idea of thinking that whether there are such things as particles that cannot be seen or even detected. Before that was proposed, I wonder how many scientists were talking about finding things that could not be found. Although it sounds a bit silly, it was a question that had a profound effect on particle physics research. And by some it was considered instrumental in the discovery of the neutrino. I hate neutrinos. There are so many of them constantly passing through our world and through our bodies, in addition to being produced all over, even emitting from our bodies. And I cannot do anything about seeing, hearing, or touching these trillions of little things. In fact, they have such little mass, it's like they don't exist at all. In addition, they are so darn puny that they mostly pass through electron fields, rarely hitting the nucleus of an atom. And they are spit out on the other end of the planet with ease. They are like ghosts. The only way to find them is to spend hundreds of millions of bucks going several hundred feet underground into these futuristic-looking tanks, waiting a long time just to get a faint little blink from one of those elusive little guys. Something else I hate are single-cell organisms. By themselves, they rarely even have any effect on anything, unless they multiply. It is only when they get together in massive quantities that they will ever be noticed. Life developing on Earth was actually not much of a big deal compared to the development of multicellular organisms, especially considering how much time it took. After Earth cooled enough to sustain bodies of water, it took hundreds of millions of years to somehow allow ample time to happen to randomly mix various kinds of carbon and mostly amino acids and wait for some type of jump start that might have occurred through lightning or some type of thermal vents in ancient oceans. However, for those of us who are more science-based than faith-based in our ideology, we have to admit that there was a greater miracle when cells started getting together to create multicellular organisms, like us, for instance. We are a bunch of skin cells, brain cells, blood cells, and boob cells. We rely on a lot of little things to make things work in order for a career to work out, especially when it comes to being recognized as some kind of public figure for your accomplishments. It takes more than a multicellular principle than it does just a single entity. If your life's dream has to do with something you can do by yourself, in addition to not requiring any visibility in order to proceed with accomplishing that dream, you're lucky. If you want a ginormous bottle cap collection, go wandering around looking for bottle caps if that is what makes you happy and fulfilled. If you have an unusual gift for designing picturesque, earthquake-proof skyscrapers, that dream will be a little more challenging. You will depend on a lot of funding, a lot of publicity, and a lot of hyper-skilled professionals at your disposal. In the meantime, we will settle for mostly ugly buildings that are flimsy because of the nincompoops who are making them. It took hundreds of millions of years on Earth before we had life in the form of unicellular organisms. Ironically, it took literally billions of years before any multicellular organisms caught on. The whole concept of let's get together is more profound than the miracle of creation itself. This is stupid. It reminds me of how developing compassion as a result of sentient, self-aware stuff came in part by the consumption of meat. It is one of the stupid things about science, reality, and living in this space-time that we call the universe. It's basically anarchy, and unless we intervene, it's left to random chance and vulnerable to tampering. In a lot of ways, there's stuff about living that has to do with a little something I'm calling, you already have to have it to get it. Picture your traditional soup line downtown with a bunch of hungry people waiting for their free lunch. When they get to the front of the line, they are met with one stipulation. They already have to have food to get food. They're hungry. Shouldn't that be a good enough reason to have food? Well, that might be true in a lot of contexts. However, in the case of things like getting visibility for your accomplishments, there's this stupid principle of having to have it to get it. Another easy thought experiment is to picture yourself dying in the desert. You stumble upon a dried up well that in fact functioned if you just had enough water to prime the pump. Unfortunately, being lost in the desert with no water, there'd be no way to stay alive even if you had that much water, and thus you die. This is where you would have to rely on an anomaly, a miracle, having to take a big leak or perhaps just call it plain luck. A flash flood occurs and you scoop enough water to get that old pump to work, or perhaps you happen to find a stranger near enough to get their attention or something like that. Otherwise, you are in a place in your life where you are stuck like one of those turtles that fall upside down and need to simply be flipped over. Although being flipped over seems like a reasonable and nearly effortless thing to do, this crowdsourced stupidity that we suffer in our society prefers to somehow let the turtle die. I learned this principle the hard way when I was launching a marketing program in order to gain visibility for my social justice and creative projects. After asking friends, family, and colleagues to help me, and some other word-of-mouth advertising, I sadly discovered that everyone preferred me invisible, no matter how much it was killing me. in addition to the fact that I was obviously incapable of accomplishing my dreams alone. That was stupidity 1. Stupidity 2 was when I decided that when compassion and empathy of humanity failed me, there was always throwing money at something. That is where I discovered an extremely stupid thing we call public relations. Websites picturing slick suit and tie hotshots claiming to be able to make you famous for the price we're marketing in their services across the globe. I happened to have the funding and assumed that was enough for a moderately priced media campaign to launch my failing business to the public. Nobody bothered to tell me that these so-called PR professionals only work with companies and individuals that are already in various degrees famous. I had to have it already to get it. In addition to being refused to do business with any of these business and professionals, I even tried to hire a consultant who ran a business in order to help people to do business with actual PR businesses. I was also refused to do business with someone who could help me to do business with these businesses because of the simple fact that my business did not have enough publicity to already get publicity, and nobody would admit that. More boring stuff. Another stupid thing I hate has to do with the times in my life when I was single and looking for a mate. I would spend years of being ignored to finally get hitched, and for a while only to find myself ironically getting a ridiculous amount of attention. When nobody wanted me, nobody wanted me. When I was wanted, that's when others wanted me. Science often tells us otherwise, though. When there is a low pressure area, the high pressure material, whether air or water, will naturally flow into the low pressure area. From a sociological standpoint, especially in this context, when you pop a balloon, it somehow gets more air in it. When you turn over a half-filled bottle of beer, instead of spilling on the floor, it somehow draws beer to the bottle and fills the cup. That defies physics, although these unreasonable behaviors are happening every day all around us. There are some examples in science where these principles do, at times, have their parallels. I hate Venus. It's pretty nice scenery if you can stand the climate for a few seconds before you burn to a crisp. It very well could have been a really lovely place at one time, but something got out of control. It is often called a negative feedback loop, or in this case, a runaway greenhouse effect. As a result of Venus getting hot, it got hotter. I hate feedback for a number of reasons. With my background in the entertainment and public speaking and as a sound engineer at times, I hate feedback. We need microphones and speakers to amplify quiet stuff. And unfortunately, the speakers and mics have to be in the same place for a live setting to work, and thus prone to those annoying moans and squeals we call audio feedback. In addition, our own world is faced with the probability of this runaway greenhouse effect, and we are likely to blame for causing it. Therefore, those who have a lot of nothing end up maintaining a lot of nothing, and those who have too much of something end up constantly multiplying too much of something that in itself will never supplement those who have nothing. A little ball of snow somehow happens to form at the top of a mountain and gets just heavy enough to roll down the hill. It doesn't have to be a special snowball. It can just be lucky, I suppose, Perhaps just literally full of crap. In most environments, this snowball effect will eventually run its course and come crashing down at a place where it cannot roll any longer, often causing mayhem and destruction. We see this especially in nations that do not accomplish much of anything when it comes to undermining corporate monopolies and things like that. A corporation that becomes too big to fail not only becomes a person with rights and privileges, he functions like a juggernaut in this economic snowball effect that we here in the United States call just business. What if a unicellular organism happens to be in the entity, or in this case, the person, that might actually have a practical answer to solve climate change on a global scale? Nobody knows this, quote, neutrino, end quote, of an idea. How do we know whether these silent people even exist, or if not? If so, how do we find them? I would like to take this grand opportunity to propose to you my big question regarding the fact that there might be something in our universe that might not be detectable with our current technology when it comes to the social sciences. This something I am referring to is actually a somebody, and in addition, definitely more than one person. Unfortunately, when conducting experiments related to physics and math, as compared to working with people, the human element always makes things a lot more difficult. At the same time, my purpose is to uphold the scientific method as much as possible, while relying on faith as a secondary measure. With that being said, the metaphors I prefer to use to attempt to tackle this problem have to do with finding little things. In this case, unicellular organisms and the more challenging neutrino. As much as I hate neutrinos, all flavors, I hate some other quirks too, and there's one thing I hate even more. I hate galaxies. I hate galaxies for two reasons. They're way too big, and there's way too many of them. When talking about galactic shit, we don't talk in the hundreds, nor the thousands, or even the millions and billions. We refer to these things in the hundreds of billions. That's just too much, not even considering multiverse shit. There are hundreds of billions of those things that contain hundreds of billions of stars. That's too many stars and too many galaxies, and I really hate them for that. It's just when it comes to stuff in our lives, artists and entertainers in particular, most of them are way too big and way too small. If only there was a way, without being some kind of oppressive regime, I hate those too, that we could somehow either make these dear folks presented more as equals without being some type of communist empire. Must I mention how much I hate those as well? Yet, an even better idea. Have creative output presented in ways that can somehow be ranked by its contribution to society, its relevance, skill, ingenuity, effort, and its ability to inspire others to do really nice stuff. Perhaps in the future, we can employ robots with not only good taste, but who also cry at movies. We can allow that type of machine learning to bombard our news feed with world-changing content from world-changing individuals, whether they are popular or not. If robots are never going to be able to determine whether something significantly contributes to society or not, why not constantly allow the people to decide? Well, that's what we do already, and the consensus is that stupidity rules. But why? The cult-like thinking of popularity means quality is as widespread these days as cigarettes are good for you was a century ago. Could we employ smart algorithms in order to filter out the stupid stuff? We also do that already, and the consensus seems to reflect that people think that computers are smart. My sister took some kind of career aptitude test based on a complex computer program back in the 1980s. She was asked if she liked working with animals. As a result of wanting to work with animals, this brilliant application, among other career options, suggested that she should consider becoming a butcher. Several decades later, although these machines have gotten smarter than that, we are still bombarded with a constant stream of wondrous misinformation. More big stuff about small stuff. Hundreds of years ago, observing a single cell was nearly impossible, in addition to the fact that the whole concept of a germ was mostly a foreign idea. Infectious diseases were explained through whatever faith or religious ideology was common at those times and places. The concept of tiny things having an effect on big things was nothing more than ancient theories that could not be proven and thus forgotten about. Finding neutrinos, on the other hand, took a lot more time and money than a simple store-bought microscope. This is the point I'm making. The search for the small is not easy and takes a lot of time, effort, thought, and thinking outside the box. In addition, searching for the ridiculously small takes even more of the same. When we find the small, observe the small, and utilize the small, great change and contributions to society often occur. Therefore, how do we apply these principles to humanity? Probably the same methods we use to detect and observe small things in the context of physics and biology. We need the right tools. There needs to be some sort of vehicle to take us to the place where we can be more effective. Otherwise, we might not be able to get anywhere. My first thought would be to apply some kind of machine learning technology to this problem. From what I've studied, the best way in recent years is that software development companies have used to train AI bots to identify and even create various common images is to integrate crowdsourced help in the process. Applying this concept to finding hidden talent would be a monumental task, and we should not rely solely on technology to accomplish this. It is obvious that AI can do little to nothing in identifying a creative product to determine its value to society. Stravinsky's Rite of Spring was a piece of music that changed the world. Can a machine tell the difference between the Rite of Spring as opposed to millions of recordings being uploaded? Machine learning of this kind would indeed be able to analyze various complexities, in addition, perhaps even comparing the recordings to other compositions in order to determine its individuality. Can this also be applied to other forms of expression like fine art, poetry, film, and others? As far as I'm concerned, robots have bad taste. And I would not trust any machine learning application effort to try to identify hidden talent without conscious human intervention. One thing we might try is to implement a massive global research project that helps to search for hidden talent that is posted on the web. Unfortunately, this would not work for anything that is not shared online. Otherwise, we might need to send out drones into places like open-air markets, art classes, and studios. Therefore, part of this undertaking might be to implement other side projects that somehow encourage and assist creatives to upload and publish their work. In addition, there can also be an element where promoters can show the work of others who, for whatever reason, will not post their creative output. This could be problematic considering issues regarding privacy and intellectual property. However, things like this should be considered. There has been little to nothing in recent years that has worked to fairly help empower creatives who were suffering in obscurity. Every effort that I've looked into, whether it starts out right or not, eventually empowers the alphas and those who have already had a significant amount of attention or possess those abilities. There are also technological platforms that turn into the snowball effect because alphas are programming the algorithms in order to favor people like themselves. Alphas believe they are entitled to lead and remain in the spotlight. This next part will be on your exam. When it comes to offline content, a few examples of this has to do with visual artists who were elderly and living with mental illness. Several years ago in my hometown, I started becoming aware of these kinds of problems, not only in my own life and business, but with others as well. Although I've been publishing all kinds of creative output online for a long time, I noticed that there were some very invisible people in the mental health community who, for various reasons, had little to no web presence. I decided that in addition to fighting my own cause, I would also fight for a greater cause. One of the examples was when I saw a flyer posted in a suburban health food store featuring the work of a very talented portrait artist. He was African American, elderly, and living with debilitating mental health issues. Even in an extremely progressive and affluent community like Greater Portland, Oregon area, this brilliant man was still working in obscurity all those years. He even painted our beloved Democrats. This particular charity organization worker was going out of her way to help advocate for this man's failed career and to no avail. I reached out to her, asking if they could do the same for others like myself, who were also suffering, and they refused. That particular worker seemed to be the only one willing to make those small efforts on behalf of one client as a special exception, only soon to scrap the whole project and leave that man to somehow fend for himself or to give up entirely. Another artist in the area who was also a senior living with debilitating conditions was someone who I had been working closely with on several occasions. She would occasionally post her pieces online, but rarely in a way that could bring anything productive, like no hashtags and stuff like that. With her permission, I began to produce better photos of her work in addition to posting on platforms that had better chances of being seen with more effective methods. Within months, her work started getting more attention. I even provided a DSLR camera for a reasonable trade in addition to some coaching, and unfortunately, for whatever reason, she would not follow through. This provides another dilemma to the concept of invisible people. There are a lot of victims suffering from being ignored for their contributions to society who, for various reasons, self-sabotage their opportunities to be successful. At times, I have been an enabler of this, and actually do not blame myself or others for giving up in this capacity because of the immense social pressure. Alphas can be cruel in how they punish the underdogs who begin to get attention. Some of the abuse we suffer makes it nearly impossible to proceed. In this particular situation, that older woman was married to a powerful public figure who was very jealous. And I can imagine that every time she got more attention than him, he and perhaps other alphas would find a way to make her miserable and even disappear. People were undermining her credibility in addition to the charity groups that were supposed to be showcasing her work. Were treating her with such disrespect and unfair methods to demote her publicly, she would react and thus cheapen her work. There were many of her most brilliant works that she would not show to anyone, in addition to many that were underpriced, sold for little to nothing, and even painted over. This was heartbreaking, and I finally decided to move on, in addition to the fact that there were countless examples of lost work that were not only devalued by their community, the artists themselves devalued their own work significantly. I'm glad that there was at least one scientist who considered that there might be little things all around us that nobody knows about, and that there may be, we can try to find ways to find these little things to determine if they exist and if they might have some use. If it weren't for research in particle physics, which includes various flavors of neutrinos, we'd probably not have the mobile technology we have today, in addition to a lot of practical innovations. Basically, if it weren't for particle physics research efforts, instead of a smartphone, you'd be carrying around a typewriter, a movie camera, and a file cabinet, in addition to other stuff your mobile devices can do. That being said, who's to say that my research concerning invisible people would not have any positive effect on society? The theories of invisible particles have led to efforts to detect these little things, which have led to numerous innovations that have advanced civilization. Unless we as a society make these issues visible and work towards a practical solution, chances are these problems will not fix themselves. There are anomalies in history that have prompted innovation and creative expression without much of anything to do with consciously trying to bring visibility to those deemed invisible. The baby boom was a timely occurrence that happened during a period in history when there was a growing underground that was appealing to counterculture, which has always been appealing to young people. It is just that there was not a lot of visibility until a population wave of youngsters began to be more exposed to alternative ideas and creative expressions. For instance, a blue-collar port in the UK, Liverpool, gave some young artists an opportunity to listen to underground African-American music, the growing population of youngsters, plus a growing anti-authoritative ideology spread through the Western world and soon all over the globe. Independent media became a vehicle for more creative expression and ideas to spread, and thus, as a byproduct, invisible people became visible enough to make a significant difference in the world. It's hard to say whether these individual silent voices being heard in the 1960s were underdogs or alpha, but one thing is certain: the principle of the invisible being seen and the silent being heard brings positive change and innovation to a world that needs to constantly progress.